Hello everyone, I'm Yasser Saeed and welcome to the class of International Trade Theory, Econ 446. Here today we are going to study the Standard Trade Model. Now in this lecture we are going to study how to measure the values of production and how to measure the value of consumption. Then we are going to study the welfare and terms of trade. Then the effect of these things on the economic growth, and then we will be studying the effect of international transfers of income, and finally we are going to study the effects of imports tariff and export subsidies in this scenario in the standard trade model. In this section today we are going to discuss the welfare effects of the international trade and the standard trade model. So basically we use the terms of trade to explain this welfare effect, and the terms of trade is actually the price of exports relative to the price of imports. Why is this important? Why is the term of trade important? Um, See, when we export something, we gain income from that. We gain foreign reserves. We increase our foreign reserves through exporting goods. While we import, we have to pay the foreign reserves, or we may say that we have to pay in terms of dollars. So exports is basically our income, and imports is basically our expenditure. Now, when the price of something that we export increase, for example, we are exporting cloth and the price of cloth increase, the term of trade increases. Why? Because now we get more income, whereas the price of imports has remained the same. So we are earning more income and we are spending less. Therefore, whenever the price of exports increases, we say the terms of trades have improved. And because of higher price for exports mean that the country can afford to buy more imports, and increase in terms of trade increase the welfare of that country. Because of this higher purchasing power, we say that the welfare of the country has increased. So that is the basic relationship between the welfare and the terms of trade. A decrease in the terms of trade, on the other side, decreases the country's welfare, because if price of imports increases, such as in this scenario in Pakistan recently, when the dollar value has jumped from 100 rupees to 150, so imports basically have become more expensive for us, whereas exports have become cheaper for us. The value of our products that we are exporting is now not that much as compared to whatever we are importing. So in this sense, we say that the terms of trade has decreased for us, and so is the country's welfare decreased for us. Then, what determines this terms of trade, or we also call it the relative price, the price of exports to the price of imports, and that is the relative price. So, to determine the price of cloth relative to the price of food in our model, we again use the relative supply and relative demand. We have used relative supply and relative demand in the Ricardian model, as well as we have used that same concept in the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So it is basically common in both the models, and so it is also the same in the standard trade model. Now, the relative supply considers the world supply of cloth relative to food at each relative price. And then the relative demand considers world demand of cloth relative to that of food at each relative price. So in the two-country model, we say that the world quantities are the sum of quantities from domestic and foreign countries. In a two-country model, basically the world supply is the domestic supply and the foreign supply, and the world demand is the domestic demand and the foreign country demand. If we have more than that, we will add up all the supply of each and every country and the demand of each and every country. We will have to add up all of them. Then here is a graphical representation of the world relative supply in the red line, and the blue line indicates the world relative demand. And the equilibrium price, that is the relative price, that is the price of clothes to price of food, whereas the quantities are the summation of quantity, as we have discussed just now, the quantity of cloth produced domestically plus quantity of cloth produced or consumed in the foreign country, divided by the total quantity of food, and that is the domestic food plus the food in foreign country. Now here we are able to answer some of the questions. Is economic growth in China good for the standard of living or the welfare in another country? Or we may say that if uh, China is growing continuously, is that good for Pakistan? Or whether if there is a growth occurring in India, whether that impacts the welfare in Pakistan? So we can answer the question with the help of this standard great growth model. So basically we rephrase the question: is growth in a country more or less valuable when it is integrated into the world economy? So we get answers from the standard trade model, and let me explain how standard trade model gives us answers to such questions. Now, when we talk about growth is usually biased. It isn't all the same for all industries within a country. For example, if we say Pakistan is growing, it doesn't mean that Pakistan economy is growing in each and every sector. It might be growing in agriculture, it might be growing in the industrial sector, but all sectors are not expected to grow at the same time. Some of the sectors will improve, whereas other sectors may remain constant, while some of the sectors may see a downfall. So growth basically means we are growing in a certain industry. And when we are studying the standard trade model, we are an exporting country, and let's say we are producing clothes and food as well, but we have comparative advantage in production of clothes, and then we are able to grow in that sector. Then the overall production possibility frontier will not shift equally, but it will change greatly on the cloth sector, whereas a little bit improvement might be shown in the food sector. You can see an example from the US economy, where rapid growth has occurred in US computer industries, but the relatively little growth has occurred in textile industries in the US. Similarly, according to the Ricardian model, the technological progress in one sector causes biased growth. We see that technology is growing day by day: softwares, communications, online techniques, and all these things are developing. So they have an impact on the economy, but that impact is not in a single in the overall economy, but a single sector. According to Heckscher-Ohlin model, an increase in one factor of production, that is an increase in the labor force either, or it may be an increase in the land resources. We may be able to create dams, and with those dams we may be able to water more agriculture land. So the irrigation techniques are improving, giving us more land. So any of the factors, when they increase, they can cause bias growth. Why? Because all factors are not equally used in all sectors. Some factors are mostly used in the capital industry. Other factors will be mostly used in the agriculture industry. For example, industries such as electronics, that produce electronic components, they will not require too much land. But if we are producing agriculture products, that will require a lot of land. So an improvement in land will cause a biased increase in the agriculture sector, whereas an improvement in capital, whereas an improvement in technology will cause a biased increase in the electronics or the capital market. So basically, the growth is biased. Here we discuss two graphs. Uh, and the same graph, but we see two types of shifts in it. We have two products, that is the food and the cloth. The y-axis represents the quantity of food produced in an economy, whereas the x-axis shows the quantity of cloth produced in the economy. The first production possibility frontier, TT1, is somewhat the same. It is common in both the economies except for the ISO value line. The ISO value line is different, but the production possibility frontier is the same in both graphs. Now, in the first graph, in graph A, we see a biased growth towards cloth. Maybe we have some new technology, new machinery, new equipment developed in the textile sector, so we are producing more of cloth, but at the same time there is an improvement in food as well because of using some of the resources over there as well. And in graph B we see that food has substantially increased. There is a growth in the food sector and a little increase in the cloth sector. Now what happens when such type of increase occurs? If you look at the first graph, the ISO value line is exactly the same for the first production possibility frontier and the second production possibility frontier. But after the shift in the production possibility frontier, the overall quantity of cloth definitely has increased. But we have reduced the production of food. The food, let me highlight that to you with the pen. You see that initially our food level was higher than after a growth has occurred in the cloth sector. Why does this happen? This is again taken from the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Whenever a factor increase in certain sector, and for example, cloth uses you see machinery more intensively, and capital has increased, so we are having biased growth towards the cloth. This will also take some certain resources out from the food sector, so the overall supply in the food sector will decline, but the overall supply in the cloth sector, that has increased. We explained that through the Edgeworth box diagram, explaining how these resources, the changes in resources, can also change the allocation of these resources. Now the same is true in graph B. If you look at the quantity of food, that is not much visible, but you can see a slight decrease has occurred in the quantity of food, or maybe it is just equal, but we may expect a slight decrease in the production of cloth, but there is a large increase in the production of food. So this is the impact of growth in the economy. When growth happens, this is the basic impact of it. Now, biased growth and resulting change in relative supply cause a change in terms of trade. When growth occurs, in the graph, we didn't show any change in price. The price remained constant. But in reality, what happens? Heckscher-Ohlin model didn't predict that change in price, but in reality, prices do change. The relative price will change. How? When growth occurs, supply of certain good increases. In our example now that we have studied, in the first graph, supply of clothes increased dramatically. In the second graph, supply of food increased dramatically. When supply of certain goods increase, then the prices has to decrease. Their prices decrease, and therefore a change in the terms of trade occurs as well. Bias growth in cloth industry in either domestic or foreign country will lower the prices of cloth relative to the prices of food, and lower the terms of trade for cloth exporters. And then biased growth in food industry in either the domestic or foreign country will raise the price of clothes relative to the price of food and raise the terms of trade for cloth exporters. Suppose that the domestic country exports cloth and imports food. For example, in case of Pakistan, we are exporting cloth and importing tea and other oils from foreign country. Now, what will happen in such scenario? The relative supply of cloth will increase, and when the relative supply of cloth increase, price of cloth relative to price of food will decrease. So the terms of trade has worsened for us. Now, whoever may increase the supply, whether this increase has occurred from domestic economy or whether this increase has occurred from outside the economy, from a foreign competition. For example, India is producing more cloth in our competition as well. So what happens if a growth in cloth sector occurs? The prices will decrease and the terms of trade will worsen. Now let us explain further what how this impacts our domestic. This graph shows a biased increase in food sector. So the relative supply basically will shift backwards. You know that whenever things in denominator increase, the overall value decreases. So here the price of we see that the price of food has basically decreased because price of food is in denominator. Export bias growth is growth that expands the country's production possibility disproportionately that country export sector. So if we are exporting cloth and an increase in cloth occurs, we say that this is an export bias growth. But if you are exporters of cloth and increase in food occurs, then that is import bias growth. Now the impact of such growth is that bias growth in the food industry in the foreign country is export bias growth for the foreign country because they are exporting food, but it is an import bias growth for us. Then import bias growth is a growth that expands country production possibility in the sector that we are importing. Biased growth in cloth production in the foreign country is import bias growth for the foreign country. What is the consequence? Export bias growth reduces country's terms of trade, generally reducing its welfare and increasing the welfare of foreign countries. Why? Because whenever we are exporting something and the overall supply increases, the prices will decrease. Hence, they are importing it cheaply than before. So their terms of trade increase, whereas our terms of trade has decreased. Import bias growth increases a country's terms of trade, generally increasing its welfare and decreasing the welfare of foreign country. So whenever we are importing something and foreign countries are good at producing it, then the supply of that good will increase, and that will become cheaper for us to import. So the basic result here is, the basic conclusion here is that we would love other countries to grow in those sectors, uh, in those goods which we are importing. But if they are getting better in the production of what we are exporting, then that is not good for our country. That is not good for the terms of trade of our country, because that good will become cheaper and then we will be selling that good at a lower price. Now, has growth in Asia reduced the welfare of high-income countries? And this is the question that we ask in the first place. The standard trade model predicts that import buys growth in China reduce the US terms of trade and standard of living in the US. Import-wise growth for China would occur in sectors that compete with US exports, but the prediction is not supported by data, and there should be negative change in the terms of trade in the US and other high-income countries. We do not find any evidence in the studies for it. In fact, changes in the terms of trade for high-income countries have been positive and negative for developing Asian countries. The results are different, but the theory predicts us. Here is the evidence. Advanced economies, the average annual percentage change in terms of trade is 0.8. That has increased, but in 1996 to 2005, that has decreased by minus 0.1. Whereas in the developing Asia, it has decreased in both the time periods.